Oui, un véritable merci au groupe de chanteuses de Ghana-Sétagé pour avoir partagé avec nous leur voix mélodieuse. Merci encore. J'aimerais maintenant vous présenter notre prochain interlocuteur, qui est le ministre de la Justice du Canada et le procureur général du Canada. Et je voudrais vous présenter l'honorable Arif Virani, ministre Virani. Et également, après la présentation de M. Virani, il y aura une période de questions qui va être animée par ma collègue Victoria. And as I said, there will be a question period after Minister Virani's presentations, and my colleague Victoria will manage the question period. Thank you. C'est votre tour. Yes, it's your turn.
Good morning. Kwe, Ulakut, Tanshi, bonjour, and hello. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that we are here today gathered in Gojage, the traditional territory of the Ganyage Haga, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as the meeting place of many First Nations, including the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and the Anishinaabe. Je suis reconnaissant d'avoir la chance de participer à ce rassemblement important pour écouter et apprendre en toute humilité en tant que nouveau ministre de la Justice et procureur général du Canada. I have a great deal to learn from all of you, families, communities who are undertaking this difficult and sacred work of searching for and honoring the children who never returned from Indian residential schools. I made a point of coming up on the stage and actually speaking with Emma and Angie and Norman because I was here for most of their presentation and listening quite intently as to what was being shared, sharing with us with a great deal of courage about their own past and what we have to learn and to teach us from those pasts. I also want to acknowledge the person who I was just sitting next to, which is Kimberly Murray, and for her tremendous progress over these last 15 months. Her role is one that requires enormous emotional strength, advocacy, wisdom, and tireless dedication. We're grateful for your work, Kimberly, and that of everyone who is supporting you. C'est un privilège de poursuivre le travail important accompli par mon prédécesseur, l'honorable David Lametti, pour faire avancer la réconciliation ainsi que la mise en œuvre et le respect des droits des peuples autochtones. Comme vous le savez peut-être, j'ai été secrétaire parlementaire du ministre de la Justice de 2018 à 2021. Et pendant ce temps-là, j'ai appris beaucoup de choses au cours de cette période et j'ai maintenant hâte de mettre ces connaissances à profit. In my time with you today, I wanted to share my thoughts on where we are in our reconciliation journey and also on our next steps forward. I want to reflect on our government's progress in responding to the TRC calls to action. I want to recognize Marie and others in this room who are so critical to the work of the TRC Commission. But I want to reflect on the calls to action that proceeded from that commission, particularly as it relates to the justice system, and speak to why we are gathered here today, the important work of the independent special interlocutor, Kim, and the pathway ahead. So first on this theme of reconciliation. It's one of the most challenging and important subjects that we face as a country today. It's much more than just a simple mandate for the Minister of Justice and a government priority. It's something that I'm committed to and all of my cabinet colleagues are committed to, including the Prime Minister. I mentioned my previous role at the Justice Ministry, but before that time I actually held the position of Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage during the development of the Indigenous Languages Act. As you are well aware, most Indigenous languages in Canada are critically endangered, part of the devastating legacy of Indian residential schools. That was my first involvement with reconciliation as a parliamentarian, and that journey started for me in 2017. I traveled the country, conducting numerous consultations and roundtables to help build up the necessary relationships that supported the co-development of what became the Indigenous Languages Act. In so doing, I met with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit elders, knowledge keepers, language experts, women, men, and youth, 2S LGBTQI individuals. I think the best thing that I can tell you about that experience is something I was reflecting on when I heard from the two women who are on stage with me right now, which is in hearing about their experiences as young girls at the Indian Residential School, I reflected on what I was learning when I was doing those consultations on language protection and revitalization. And then I thought to my role as a father, I'm the father of 2 boys, and I thought to the fledgling efforts my wife and I make to try and impart some South Asian culture, which is our culture, to our children, like many parents in Canada would try to do. And it's a bit of a work in progress, obviously, but we try to impart the skills of Hindi, the predominant language in India, to our children. I don't speak it well enough. My wife speaks it better than I do, but it's a work in progress, trying to impart those skills in another language to our children. But then I reflected on the experiences we just heard about, and I reflected on the consultations and what I heard. And what I heard was it wasn't just about the ability to maintain Cree or Anishinaabe or Dene or Sioux or Inuktitut. It was about the fact that you were ripped away from your families, placed in a foreign location, and if you dared to speak any of those languages, you were beaten. And that's something that no immigrant parent who's trying to teach their kid about speaking Tagalog or Hindi or Spanish or you name it ever has to deal with. And that's the difference between the legacy of the colonial and racist residential school system and what we have today in terms of intergenerational trauma and a lack of, in that case, language facility. And I'll tell you, it was hard for me to hear that. It was hard for me to understand it and really internalize it. But after I started to come to terms with it and that legacy, what it did is it inspired me to work harder in listening, work harder in learning, and work harder in co-developing, meaning doing it in true partnership with Indigenous peoples. And that dovetails with what Angie said, because what she said quite sternly, and I was listening because I was right in her line of sight, she spoke to government, and she said government has to approach this differently, in a way that is earnest, on a true and genuine path, in good faith with Indigenous communities. And that means all of you, in doing this in a shared model, as opposed to a paternalistic model. That's the approach I've tried to take as a parliamentarian. That is absolutely the approach I will endeavor to take every single day I have the privilege of serving as Minister of Justice. Everyone in this room knows that it's not just about intentions or professions of good faith. It's about actually rolling up one's sleeves and doing the work. And there's a great deal of work to be done. I'm joined today in this room by my Assistant and Advisor on Indigenous Matters, Tanya Monahan. Also, our Associate Deputy Minister is here. My staff, my department, we are here to work with all of you to speed up the process of undoing 150 years of colonialism and racism that these schools exemplified. Understanding your experiences and your trauma is central for us to do that work and do it successfully. It will take time, it will be difficult, it will be contentious, but the payoff will be huge for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, including those of you in this room, but also for the country as a whole. At Justice, the centerpiece of that work is implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. En juin dernier, notre gouvernement a annoncé, aux côtés des dirigeants autochtones, la publication du plan d'action relatif à la loi sur la Déclaration des Nations Unies. qui a été élaboré en consultation et en collaboration avec les peuples autochtones d'une notion à l'autre. Le plan d'action est une feuille de route transformationnelle des mesures que le Canada prendra en partenariat avec les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis en vue de la mise en œuvre des droits et les principes énoncés dans la Déclaration des Nations Unies. Il comporte 180 mesures visant à faire respecter les droits de la personne des peuples autochtones, à lutter contre les injustices, les préjugés et la discrimination, et nous guider vers un avenir plus équitable. J'ai hâte de travailler avec nos partenaires pour concrétiser ces mesures et apporter des véritables changements. Indigenous leadership has long called on Canada to take action on overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. The intergenerational impacts of residential schools, as well as colonial laws and racist policies, have had calamitous effects on Indigenous people for decades. We've listened and are developing an Indigenous justice strategy in consultation and cooperation with Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. The strategy is our shared opportunity to identify legislative, program, and policy measures to support the revitalization of Indigenous legal traditions and justice systems. It also focuses on creating necessary changes within the existing criminal justice systems. I'm going to open a parenthesis here, deviate from the script. Tanya will forgive me, but one thing that I've definitely learned in my time as a lawyer and in my time as a parliamentarian, that if you look at the overrepresentation statistics of Indigenous men and women in prisons, when Indigenous communities are themselves responsible for their own policing of their communities and their own legislating and judicial or justice responses in their communities, the level of incarceration and criminalization goes down. And that's an important feature. It's much like the features we've learned about in terms of Indigenous people having control over their own education, having control over their own language facility. Things tend to improve when people are making decisions for themselves, exactly as Angie was cautioning us to do. That's the kind of approach that I want to see more of and that I want to empower more of. There are links between this process and the work of the special interlocutor, as well as the experiences of survivors, families, communities, and Indigenous experts. You have knowledge and understanding that can help build a fairer, more accessible, and decolonized justice system. The second theme I wanted to talk about is progress on the TRC calls to action. Implementing the TRC calls to action is critical. I know that some of you will feel that the pace of change is too slow, but I want you to know that the government is fully committed to fulfilling our pledge to respond to the TRC's final report and find a better path forward together. Nous répondons notamment aux appels à l'action 30, 34 et 38 qui visent à éliminer la surreprésentation des Autochtones dans le système de justice. J'ai fait mention précédemment de la stratégie en matière de justice autochtone. J'ajouterai que nous appuyons les efforts communautaires dirigés par les Autochtones en vue d'améliorer l'accès à la justice et accroître l'application des principes de l'arrêt GLADU et le recours aux mesures de justice réparatrices. Nous donnons suite à l'appel l'Action 40 en finançant les services et les programmes de soutien destinés expressément aux victimes autochtones. Nous effectuons également d'autres investissements pour stabiliser et améliorer les unités de liaison pour l'information à l'intention des familles et l'initiative de soutien communautaire et de guérison pour les familles. Together, these initiatives help the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people to access all the available information they seek about their loved ones, wherever that information may be. They also enable families to access Indigenous-led community support services to cope with grief and healing. En ce qui concerne l'appel à l'Action 42, nous continuons de discuter et de négocier des ententes sur l'administration de la justice pour renforcer les systèmes de justice communautaire et soutenir l'autodétermination avec diverses communautés autochtones d'une notion à l'autre. Exactly what I was just referring to in terms of empowering communities to make these important decisions for themselves. Through our Justice Partnership and Innovation Program, we're responding to Call to Action 50 by supporting Indigenous-led projects to revitalize traditional Indigenous legal systems, as well as providing $10 million to establish Indigenous law institutes. I'll open another parenthesis. I graduated from law school in 1998. I'm a little bit older than I look. Back in 1998, I studiously avoided Aboriginal law as a subject back then because it was complicated and because it was relatively despair-inducing in terms of the subject matter and what was being taught. It was right around the time that the last residential school was closing, finally. What is critical now is that we ensure that Indigenous communities have access to Indigenous legal traditions and Indigenous judicial responses, criminal justice responses, but also that the mainstream of Canada gets the same access in terms of complementing its learning. It would be a much better situation if we had all of that learning proficient at law schools around the country, with law enforcement around the country, and indeed in terms of the judicial training that is provided. To date, we've signed 27 funding agreements to support the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous laws and legal traditions across Canada. Most directly relevant to this gathering, we're continuing our efforts to respond to calls to action 72 to 76, which relate directly to the work that Kimberly is leading, to the work you're hearing about over these 3 days, the devastating impact of missing children and the lack of burial information. We've committed more than $238 million to support Indigenous-led research, knowledge gathering, commemoration, memorialization, and fieldwork investigation around the sites of former residential schools, as well as having provided over $17 million of funding for the work of Ms. Murray and her office. In terms of where we are, this brings me back to why we are here today. The last residential school closed its doors in the late 90s. Nearly 30 years ago, but not long enough ago. But we know too well that they are not gone. It was the discovery of the unmarked graves at Tecumloops in British Columbia and other locations throughout the country that led to the appointment of Kimberly Murray as special interlocutor. And let me again open a parenthesis. I am a member of Parliament as well as a minister. People around the country were talking to their members of Parliament when that discovery was made. They were opening their eyes and learning about it. I had children who were predominantly white school kids coming to me, coming to my office, engaging with me and saying, what are we doing about those 215 bodies that were found? And more bodies have been found since. And that is important in terms of transparency and accountability, but it's critical in terms of Canadians' awareness of what is taking place. And Canadians are pushing for this. And they're pushing parliamentarians like myself for answers and responses that Kimberly's work is helping to inform. So know that in terms of the vantage point from a person who represents a community in Toronto, 6 hours away from here, but my experience is indifferent to my colleagues of all political stripes from all political parties around the country. The cruel legacy is one of lost children, lost languages and cultures, lost opportunities to thrive, to grow and live full and healthy lives, and perhaps most critically, silenced truths. There's so much more truth to be learned, accepted, and understood by governments and by all people in Canada. One of my first meetings with Indigenous leaders, virtually, was with Kim. I conveyed to her then how important her work is to me and to our government. I'm looking forward to her ongoing work and her final report. Our government has already received the interim report and its recommendations. I've reviewed those, and those highlight several ongoing legal challenges. One of them is accessing and preserving data and records. I heard that loudly and clearly from the people who were up here, that we have to speak about this. The courage that we saw from these women here and Norman is about voicing their histories because they don't want history to repeat itself. That's about data preservation, archiving, and collection. It's about making sure those stories are not lost. It's something Kimberly and I have already been speaking about, and I will continue to speak about with her. It's about protecting the sites of the former schools. It's about addressing the troubling narrative of denialism. Ces recommandations sont essentielles pour tracer les voies que nous suivrons ensemble afin de mettre en place un cadre juridique qui préserve et protège les droits et la dignité des enfants qui reposent dans les tombes et des sépulcres anonymes. Grâce à votre participation à ce rassemblement, vous contribuez directement à la mise en place de ce cadre. Some people have come a long way to attend. I want to acknowledge that. I cannot imagine how difficult it is for you to relive past traumas, either personally by sharing them or hearing other persons' traumas. I want to thank you for sharing your experiences with me and with the special interlocutor. It is critically important to this work, and good will come out of this sharing. The pain you feel today is only made worse by those who deny this tragic chapter in our shared history. In her interim report, Ms. Murray was very blunt. She said, quote, "Denialism is violence, denialism is hate," end quote. Let me add my voice to Kimberly Murray's. We must not and cannot deny what happened to hundreds of thousands of children at residential schools across this country. We must not and cannot deny the resulting pain, the intergenerational trauma that still haunts survivors, families, and communities to this very day. While I would not presume to say that I comprehend your deep pain and trauma, I cannot empathize with it. I just want to give you a tiny bit of context from my own vantage point, that I bring my own lived experiences to my role as a parliamentarian and as a minister. I understand violence, I understand hate, I understand discrimination and racism. My family's journey to this country is one of flight from a country in East Africa called Uganda, when we were expelled by a brutal military dictatorship in 1972. I grew up as a brown-skinned Muslim man in this country, in a country that didn't look a lot like me, didn't understand me, my family, our community, and our upbringing. These experiences shaped who I am, the same way your experiences have shaped who you are. What I became is a person who's dedicated his work as a university student, as a lawyer, and now as a parliamentarian to equality, to fighting for fairness, to combating discrimination, and promoting human rights. But I'll tell you something I've told my constituents many times in Parkdale High Park, that I don't think you can work on the issues that I want to work on in terms of promoting equality at this level in Canada, unless you understand foundational inequality in Canada that is steeped in centuries of colonialism and racism. And what I mean by that is that you don't get to the point of religious equality, racial equality, things like acceptance of sexual orientation, unless you understand the foundational violations of equality that have been fomented on the people in this room by European settlers who imposed their will in a colonial and racist manner. I believe that in my heart, and that's what I am committed to you to working to address. This is what I will bring to my work on this issue and all of my work as Minister of Justice. Nous avons parcouru un chemin ensemble sur la voie de la réconciliation. Ce parcours n'a pas toujours été facile, mais il n'est pas censé de l'être non plus. C'est un travail ardu et complexe qui requiert la patience, de la compassion et de l'ouverture au changement. Sachez que je suis pleinement déterminé à aller à l'avant pour mettre en œuvre la loi sur la Déclaration des Nations Unies et les mesures qu'on trouve dans le plan d'action à donner suite aux appels à l'action de la CVR et à faire face à la tragédie des pensionnats indiennes au moyen d'une approche juste, empreinte de compassion et dirigée par les Autochtones. On that note, I want to conclude by thanking Kimberly and her team for the invitation to be here. Noya Goa. And to all of the survivors, families, community members here today, thank you for sharing your truths, and thank you for having the courage to share your truths. Truths that everyone in this country, elected officials and everyone else, need to hear, accept, and reflect on. And I'll leave you with the words of our Governor General, Her Excellency the Right Honourable Mary May Simon, who will be taking part in this gathering tomorrow. She said, quote, "The truth unites us as a nation, brings us together to dispel anger and despair and embrace justice, harmony, and trust instead," end quote. Let's move ahead with Mary Simon's words in our hearts. Chimigwech, Noya, Nakormik, merci, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for having me.
Check, check, 1, 2, check. Thank you, Minister Virani, not only for your words, but for listening to our survivors this morning and for adding your voice. Thank you very much. Minister Virani will now take a few questions. We have some mics set up. Mic number 1 will say by the wall, mic number 2 in the center, mic number 3 by the door. So what we'd ask is please state your name and your question to the minister. And I see we have a lineup at mic number 2. We could start there. Mic number 2, please state your name and your question, please.
Ani, I'm Dana Hickey. I listened to what you said about how you worked on the Language Act in 2017 and about your thoughts on co-development, which is a very problematic issue that we also have, and I didn't hear you address that. You said there's a great deal of work to be done, which is true. And I want to point out that one of the major challenges to that kind of work in regard to especially your department is the recent switch from Minister Lametti over to yourself. Many people in this room already developed relationships with Minister Lametti, and a lot of work was done, including our concerns on co-development and other issues. And unfortunately, in my view, and many Canadians, the way that the cabinet was shuffled and the replacement of the MOJAG, Minister of Justice and Attorney General, the reasons stated for that, they don't wash. And so this is a problem just from the get-go, is that and this is intentional, is that so the person whom we already have the relationships with, and that as a human being feels emotions such as an obligation to be truthful, to knowingly address actual harm that has happened and not pretending, all those things, that stuff is gone because that relationship has been eliminated, and that's been done on purpose. Also, with the co-development, I know that you are involved in the Language Act, and we have many problems with co-development. I invite anyone to get up here and tell me an example of any time that co-development was authentic or real in Canada on any of these acts. Anybody that wants to come up here and say that, I would be amazed, because it's not true, and all of us know that it's not true. And that's the case with the Languages Act, distinctions-based Indigenous health legislation, policing as an essential service, UNDRIP, sir, okay, and it goes on. So then, you know, when we're talking about fair, accessible, decolonized, all these things, none of that has occurred. So we've had many people such as yourself get up and say these things. But then we only see the same thing over and over and over again. And that's because the Prime Minister of Canada isn't interested in these things, and he controls the cabinet, which we've also seen clearly in recent years. Transparency, accountability, and also I'd like to address this issue of denialism. So in Canada, for those who don't know, there is the white supremacists who run the government, and then there's a whole community of white people that have an entire philosophy, there's a whole story, a whole narrative of what's going on. It's very well known. Many of us have been taught it. I've been taught it. Many people all over the place have been taught it. So then, I agree that we're not going to allow denialism that, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children attended these schools and the things that happened there. However, I'm not going to be supporting criminal charges or criminal code additions for denialism when we don't even know, we need to study what these people are saying. We need to study what's going on. These people have specific stories regarding specific individuals, specific priests and nuns and so on like that, and they are tied to specific areas. For example, I grew up in a place called Port Alberni, and I have quite a bit of information about what went on there. These are things that are not discussed in your cabinet chambers, sir. And I don't think that you maybe grew up around these people, and you probably haven't heard it, but I'm telling you, this stuff is really well known. So denialism, we're not, I don't understand what leadership is doing here. If they're going to get up and sort of across the board, we're going to say no denialism, this and that, I'm sorry, but what we should be studying is what these people are saying, what parts of it are true, what parts of it are bogus, what is the real story here? And before there's any criminal charges or anybody's threatened with anything for denying something, we need to make sure that it's not true, that things are, what's the difference, what's true and what's false, what's real and what's fake. So everyone needs to know that. Every Canadian that wants that information needs to know that, and we have to tell the truth. So these are my comments. I'm interested for you to respond on the co-development piece And what is it you're going to do? Because, for example, Mr. Lametti knows that, since 2020, I arrived here in Ottawa, and it's very difficult to get rid of me. And so then I'll be checking to see
we have
how
7
it
people
is.
at the mic. Can you ask your question, please?
Sure.
Thank
so
you.
then I will be there to try to understand how is it that this time it's actually co-developed, and how is it that you will show me that? Thank you.
So thank you. There was a lot there in terms of some of the things you raised. So first of all, with respect to sort of David Lametti and as my predecessor, David Lametti did tremendous work. I was his parliamentary secretary. I think the best thing I can say to you is that yes, there's been a change of ministers, but in terms of continuity and familiarity with Indigenous issues, I don't come to this table without having some experience, the Indigenous Language Act being the primary source of that experience. I would also say to you that the commitment to reconciliation and advancing Indigenous issues is shared by all members of Cabinet, but it's also shared by all members of our caucus across the board, and I mean that very sincerely. Secondly, I would say to you that with respect to the co-development piece, I'll just be candid, you're being candid with me, and that's good. I'll be candid with you, that when we embarked upon co-developing the language piece of legislation in 2017, it caused consternation among the departments in Ottawa. So among the civil servants, they were a bit nervous. How does this work? Does it subvert parliamentary privilege? We've never really done it this way. Since we co-developed the languages piece, we've also worked on child welfare legislation. With respect to Kimberley's own office, when the unmarked graves were discovered in Tecumloops, we reached out again in a partnership model with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders and co-developed the idea of having a special interlocutor, and then we didn't impose her mandate or terms of reference. We consulted on that and co-developed even the terms of reference. So is better possible? Of course it's possible. But are we doing it actively and trying to live it? We are doing it actively and trying to live it. And with respect to UNDRIP, which you finished on, I would say to you that it's one thing to pass UNDRIP, it's another thing to actually respond to it in a meaningful way. And the 181 measures that I indicated that are in the action plan to give meaning to UNDRIP were co-developed. We didn't dream those up ourselves in some cabinet room. We reached out to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders to come up jointly with what we should be doing to give meaning to UNDRIP. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat it and say it's working perfectly. I'm sure it isn't working perfectly. But it is, from my perspective, a lot better than where we were prior to embarking upon things like the Languages Act, because we're doing it in a true spirit of cooperation and putting aside the old methods of paternalism that really characterized how the Government of Canada operated. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister Browning. We have time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to take mic number 1, and then we'll finish off with Steve on mic number 3. Your name, please, where you're from, and your question.
Thank you. My name is Joy Kramer, and my question is around comments that you made with respect to Cabinet, and that we are the priority of government. When I look at Minister Hadou and all of her responsibilities around health, child and family, education, infrastructure, water, etc., I wonder how you support her at Cabinet and how your Cabinet colleagues also support the work she's doing, because we understand that there isn't enough support at Cabinet for the work that she needs to get done to provide services, for us to provide services to our own people. And I think that that needs to become part of the conversation and part of what Cabinet needs to understand. If it's in their mandate letters, why are they not supporting Minister Hadou at that table? And how are you supporting her? Because 2 things. One is her budget is going to get cut, which means our services are going to get cut, even if she's just looking to reduce staff. Number 2, how come in her budget it includes all of the settlement dollars? Why should our budget include that? It should be the core Treasury Board paying that out of their budget, not any settlement money coming through the ISK budget, because then we also are paying again for that settlement. So I think that that is wrong. So what's your opinion on that piece, the budget, including settlement dollars? And number 2, what's your opinion around how you think other Cabinet ministers should support Hadou at that table when she's pushing for our services, where all other Canadians are faring much better than us historically all through the last hundreds of years? Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for that question. So I'll start with something personal in terms of my own relationship with Patty Haidu. We were both elected in 2015 together in that same sort of class of 2015, and Patty and I struck an immediate chord with one another. She comes from Thunder Bay, as I'm sure you're well aware. She used to run a shelter and a service that dealt with people who were abused, also people that were dealing with mental health and addictions issues and drug treatment. I come from the social justice, human rights mold as a lawyer in Toronto, as somebody who created a legal clinic in Toronto. So in terms of social justice orientation, we've been on the same page for literally the past 8 years. And I've consulted with her, gotten mentorship from her, and supported her at many, many junctures during her journey in government, particularly at the cabinet table. So that's first. Secondly, I'll say to you that Patty remains the tremendous advocate that you just described. I have always endeavored to support her, including in my new role as a cabinet minister, so around the cabinet table, and know that in terms of sort of the financial climate that we are in right now, this will not come as news to you, but obviously Minister Freeland, coming out of COVID, has been looking to issues that relate to where we can do some purse tightening and belt tightening in terms of the financial money that's going out the door, given how much money was spent by our government to support Canadians during COVID. That has then begged the question about what can different ministers do in their own portfolios, within their own departments. Patty has rightfully said that the situation of Indigenous people has historic, deep-seated inequities and is very much sui generis. It's unto itself. It can't be equated to what is done in other departments. And she has voiced that, and I have backed her in terms of her advocacy on that in terms of Indigenous services, one has to treat it completely differently in terms of righting the historic wrongs. And that is something that I will continue to do as an ally of Patty's and as an ally to the communities that are represented in this room. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Virani. So final question on mic number 3, please. Please state your name and your question.
Yes, my name is Stephen Angus McCumber. I've worked for the last 17 years in Corrections Canada. I've also just become recently an elective chief on the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake. And I'll listen to many, many things here of our relatives, and we also lived through a lot of stuff in our communities collectively. What come to my mind is that when I was a boy in school, and I remember specifically in grade 3, we were taught Canadian history. And one of the first things that I had never forgot, because I'm a Mohawk, they showed drawings of Mohawks standing at where the ships would arrive and the priest would come down. And it said that these Mohawks were waiting patiently to cut out the hearts of the priest because this is how evil they were. And so working in Corrections Canada all these years, some of the first things parole officers will investigate the history of the inmate, their childhood and all these things. And so when you're taught that in school that you're such evil and all these things that you are, you certainly diminish everything about a person. And I was just kind of wondering, as part of reconciliation and truth, you have to begin with the truth. So what is the government going to do to recorrect or add to the history to say that this is not necessarily so, and the atrocities created by the government against Indigenous people in this land? I've always been kind of a history buff myself, and sometimes I wonder the comparison to the Third Reich into the treatment of the First Nations people. My uncles served in the Second World War. My uncle was just a little bit older than myself, was in the Korean War, and another uncle was in Vietnam in heavy combat. And all these things, First Nations people always stood up and rose to defend the rights of all of Canada, So now what is Canada doing to defend the rights of First Nations people? This is all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing that, and also for being so candid about the points you're making with respect to Corrections Canada. I'd say to you a couple of things. I think it starts with ensuring that we understand the truths transparently about what transpired for hundreds of years in this country at the residential schools, but more broadly speaking with respect to colonialism and those policies. What I would say to you is that we don't, at the national level, obviously deliver education in downtown Montreal to school kids, nor do we do that in downtown Calgary or downtown Toronto. But what we can do is ensure that the resources are made available to instructors, to school boards, to people that are educating young people actively. And I think that's actually dovetails directly with the work that Kimberly Murray is doing and her team, because it's similar to the work that was done by Marie and others at the TRC, which is trying to aggregate the information and compile it and make it readily available and even digestible in manners that makes it teachable to people around the country. I think that is really, really critical. What I find frightening is when we both hear about denialism, but also when we learn about impediments to the maintenance of that data and the storage of that data. That to me is troubling, because this data needs to be found, located, and then preserved in perpetuity, because it is critical for people's learning and the important issue of ensuring that history doesn't repeat itself. So that's the work that we're doing here. Some of that was reflected in the interim recommendations by Kimberly Murray in her interim report. I have no doubt we're going to see something similar in terms of setting up a framework for next actions by government about maintaining this historical archive so that people know the truth, learn from it, and don't repeat it going forward. Thank you.